Why did one episode of The Twilight Zone disappear for more than half a century, when the series itself was built on disturbing ideas? This was not the episode with the scariest monster. It was not buried because of gore, profanity, or some shocking visual that television could not handle. The episode vanished because it touched something America still struggled to face: war guilt, racism, Pearl Harbor, Japanese-American identity, and the ugly things people say when history is locked in a room with them. The episode was called The Encounter, and when it aired in 1964, it looked almost too simple. Two men, one attic, one old sword, no alien invasion, no time travel, no town trapped in another dimension, just a dusty room full of forgotten war relics, and a conversation that slowly turns poisonous. But that is exactly what made it dangerous. The Twilight Zone usually hid its social commentary behind fantasy. Here, the mask was thinner. The monster was not from outer space. The monster was memory. The story begins with Fenton, an aging World War II veteran, played by Neville. He is alone in his attic, surrounded by the trophies and leftovers of a war that ended nearly 20 years earlier. There are old uniforms, old helmets, old symbols of victory, and one object that seems to carry more weight than all the others: a Japanese sword. Fenton says he took it from a soldier during the war, and the way he handles it tells us the blade is more than a souvenir. It is proof, guilt, and a story he keeps repeating because the truth underneath is too hard to face. Then Arthur Takamori enters the attic, played by a young George Takei. Years before Star Trek made him famous, Arthur is a Japanese-American gardener looking for work. At first, nothing explodes. The scene begins almost casually, with awkward conversation and forced politeness. But the tension is already there. Fenton sees Arthur not as a man standing in front of him, but as a symbol of the enemy he fought decades earlier. Arthur tries to stay calm, but he can feel the insult hiding beneath every word. The attic becomes a battlefield before either man admits the war has started again. What makes the encounter so unsettling is how quickly ordinary conversation becomes interrogation. Fenton drinks, jokes, smiles, and then the smile curdles. He needles Arthur about his background, family, loyalty, and place in America. The episode understands something cruel. Prejudice often enters the room pretending to be curiosity. Soon Arthur is no longer a worker looking for a job. He is on trial for a war he did not start. The sword changes the energy completely. Fenton claims it carries an inscription, a warning that the sword will avenge its owner. At first, it sounds like a spooky Twilight Zone object, the kind of cursed artifact that could drive the story by itself. But the real curse is what both men bring into the attic before the blade is raised. Fenton brings buried guilt. Arthur brings inherited shame. The sword does not create hatred, it exposes it. Then the first terrible truth comes out. Fenton's heroic war story begins to crack. The man he killed may not have been attacking him. He may have been surrendering. Fenton has spent years carrying that version of himself, the veteran, the survivor, the man who did what war required. But in that attic, the sword forces him toward the darker possibility. What if his proudest trophy came from his worst moment? What if the thing he displays as victory is actually evidence? That is why this episode hits harder than a normal horror story. It does not ask whether ghosts exist. It asks whether guilt can survive longer than the people who caused it. Fenton is haunted by the version of himself he has tried to bury. The attic is full of old objects, but the most dangerous relic is his own memory. Then the episode turns toward Arthur, and this is where the controversy becomes impossible to ignore. Arthur reveals a backstory involving his father and Pearl Harbor, a story suggesting that his Japanese-American father helped signal Japanese planes during the attack. That idea struck many viewers as deeply offensive because it echoed one of the most damaging wartime suspicions placed on Japanese Americans: the idea that ancestry made them disloyal. In real American history, thousands of Japanese Americans were forced into incarceration camps during World War II, despite no mass proof of sabotage. So when the encounter used a Japanese American betrayal as part of its dramatic twist, it did not simply create tension. It reopened a national wound. That is why this episode could not be treated like just another strange chapter of the Twilight Zone. In one sense, it was trying to condemn hatred. Fenton's racism is ugly, and the episode does not ask us to admire him. But the script also gives Arthur a storyline that many felt reinforced the very suspicion it should have challenged. It is a complicated failure. It wants to expose prejudice, but it also steps into stereotype. The casting makes the story even more loaded. Neville Brand was not just pretending to understand war. He had served in World War II and was known as a decorated veteran before becoming an actor. That gives Fenton's bitterness a rough, lived-in quality. He does not feel polished. He feels damaged, like a man whose medals did not save him from what he remembers. George Takei's presence carries a different kind of weight. He was a Japanese-American actor playing a Japanese-American character in a story about wartime suspicion. And Takei's own childhood had been shaped by the incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. That knowledge changes the way the episode feels now. A role that once looked like tense television becomes heavier when you understand that the actor himself came from a community wounded by the history being dramatized. Inside the attic, the door will not open. That detail is pure Twilight Zone, but it is also the perfect metaphor. These two men are not simply trapped by magic. They are trapped by unfinished history. Fenton cannot leave the war behind. Arthur cannot escape what others project onto him. The room becomes a pressure cooker, where America's past is forced to speak out loud. There are no crowds, no courtroom, no battlefield. Just two people and all the things their country has never resolved. As the confrontation escalates, the episode becomes less about who is holding the sword and more about who is being controlled by the past. Fenton believes he owns the weapon because he took it. Arthur is drawn to it because it seems to call up rage he cannot explain. The blade becomes a symbol of revenge, but not in a heroic way. It does not bring justice. It brings collapse. When hatred is preserved like a trophy, it does not stay harmless. The ending is brutal in its simplicity. The men struggle. Fenton falls onto the sword. Arthur, overwhelmed by the violent force of the moment, takes the blade and leaps from the attic window. Then the door, which would not open before, finally moves. The trap is broken, but only after both men have been destroyed. The Twilight Zone often ends with a twist that feels clever. This one ends like a curse completing itself. Nobody wins. Nobody escapes clean. The past gets exactly what it came for. When CBS pulled the encounter from syndication, the decision helped create the legend around it. For decades, most Twilight Zone episodes lived through reruns, marathons, late-night broadcasts, and fan discovery. The encounter did not. It became the missing piece, the one people whispered about, the one that seemed too uncomfortable to sit beside the rest. A normal, controversial episode can be debated. A vanished one becomes mythology. But the word banned needs to be understood carefully. This was not a government ban. Police did not seize the film. The episode was not illegal to watch. It was pulled from regular American syndication, which can feel like erasure. For a show like The Twilight Zone, syndication was immortality. Reruns are how episodes become classics. Remove one episode from that cycle, and it becomes a ghost inside its own series. That is why the 52-year claim matters. The encounter first aired in 1964, and for generations of viewers, it was absent from the usual American rerun life of the show. When it finally resurfaced publicly in the 21st century, it did not return as just another episode. It returned as evidence that even one of television's smartest series could mishandle the very subjects it wanted to confront. It proved a story can be brave and flawed at the same time. Sometimes controversy comes from being honest in one direction and careless in another. And that is what makes this episode fascinating today. The Twilight Zone was famous for warning America about itself. Rod Serling's universe punished bigots, exposed hypocrites, and turned everyday cruelty into supernatural judgment. But the encounter asks a harder question. What happens when a moral show creates a moral problem of its own? Do we hide it, excuse it, or watch it clearly as both powerful television and a deeply uncomfortable artifact? The answer is not simple. If you watch the encounter only as a ghost story, you miss the point. If you watch it only as a racist mistake, you also miss part of the point. It is a trapped room drama about two men poisoned by history, but it is also a reminder that fiction can wound when it borrows from real suffering without enough care. It shows prejudice, but it also reflects the prejudices of the time that produced it. That tension is exactly why people still argue about it. The most disturbing part is that the episode does not feel outdated in the way we might want it to. The attic is old, the image is black and white, and the dialogue belongs to another era, but the central question remains alive. How long does a country carry the stories it refuses to correct? How long do families inherit shame that was placed on them by suspicion? How long can a man call something a victory before the truth starts whispering from underneath it? That is the real horror of the encounter. Not the sword, not the locked door. The horror is that both men are destroyed by stories they did not fully control. Fenton is trapped by the lie of his own heroism. Arthur is trapped by a national suspicion that should never have been attached to people like him. The episode's supernatural force may belong to the Twilight Zone, but the damage underneath it belongs to history. So, was the encounter banned because it was too scary? No. It was buried because it was too exposed. It put racism, war trauma, Japanese-American identity, and Pearl Harbor mythology into one small room, then let the tension burn until nobody could pretend it was only entertainment. Some viewers saw a bold confrontation with hatred. Others saw a painful stereotype given new life. Both reactions explain why the episode became untouchable. More than 50 years later, the encounter remains one of the strangest chapters in the Twilight Zone legacy. It is not the best episode, the cleanest, or the easiest to revisit, but it is one of the most revealing, because sometimes the episode a network hides tells you as much about television history as the classics it celebrates. And maybe that is the final twist. The encounter was locked away like Fenton and Arthur in that attic, trapped with everything people did not want to discuss. But when the door finally opened, what came out was not just an old episode. It was a warning from television's past. The stories we bury do not disappear. They wait. And when they return, they ask why we were afraid to face them in the first place.